So, I said I was done with Death Shadow articles, not videos. So, moving away from the traditional Jund style, gonna try something new with the Grixis. People have been talking about this a little bit, but no one has really settled on what they think is a consensus best list or anything, and I threw this thing together, and overall I was pretty pleased with it. So, pretty exciting stuff. The deck basically functions the same way. You have a low land count. In this case, I have 19 because I have a few more 1-mana cards and less zeros, and I felt like I had better ways to prevent against flooding in Snapcaster Mage. So I think the 19th land is okay. This is a Death Shadow deck. You have things like Street Wraith and Shock Lands and Thoughtseize to turn on the Death Shadow basically as early as turn 2. Most of the time it's going to be turn 3. I guess if you had a bunch of Street Wraiths, you could theoretically turn it on turn 1, but that's very, very unlikely. So, instead of Tarmogoyf, we have Tasigur and Gurmag Angler, and I'm running an additional Tasigur. I thought initially I could have like 2 and 2, but Gurmag Angler is a little too expensive, and when you're trying to play this thing as soon as possible, having the 1 mana cheaper is a pretty big deal, I think. And also Tasigur is one of the ways that helps mitigate the effect of flooding because you can just activate its ability, and it's actually pretty good. So there are a lot of combinations of cards that allow you to play one of these cards on turn 2. You could have 2 fetch lands, you could have a Thought Scour, Serum Vision, some discard spells, Street Wraith, and it seemed like Tasigur would be very, very easy to make happen on turn 2, whereas Angler, like, sometimes you would just be like, oh man, I need that Street Wraith, you know? And if you don't draw the Street Wraith, then it can be a little tough because you basically just need everything to line up perfectly. Like, you need 2 fetches and a turn 1 Thought Scour to cast Angler on turn 2. So, yeah, Tasigur. And cool thing about Tasigur and Angler is that on turn 2, you get to play another 1-mana card that also helps pay for them. So if you're like using a Serum Vision to set up your deck, or a removal spell in Fatal Push or Lightning Bolt, or a discard spell to protect it, it doesn't really matter. They're just going to delve those cards away, and it's basically like you cast those cards for free, because, you would have to pay 2 mana for this thing anyway. So, Tasigur and Gurmag Angler kind of take the spot of Tarmogoyf so that you have 8 big threats. You don't have Traverse the Uvenwald to make it so you have 12, but you do have Thought Scour and Serum Visions, and Thought Scour is a really nice way to put creatures in your graveyard for Kolaghan's command, so there is that. And since we are blue-black base, we still have 4 Thoughtseize. Inquisition is the one card that I've seen a lot of people omit from their list because they're like, oh, maybe I don't need it because I'm playing blue cards and I'll play some Mana Leaks or Counter Squalls or whatever, but I still think Inquisition is very, very good. I want a high density of discard spells to allow me to be proactive and just, like, strip my opponent's hand of all the relevant stuff while I attempt to, like, set up a Death Shadow. So I don't think I would go below 6, but to kind of hedge on that, I also play 2 Stubborn Denial, where Stubborn Denial is definitely not a proactive card. It is kind of nice in that discard doesn't stop everything. Like, when you're playing a bunch of discard spells, the thing that you're going to notice happening to you over and over and over again is that your opponent is going to peel a good spell, and you're going to be like, man, like, I just stripped your hand. I just saw your hand, like, last turn. I know you didn't have that card, and it's kind of frustrating. So Stubborn Denial has one benefit, which is it stops the top of the deck, and it allows you to basically lock up games where you have a Death Shadow or a Tasigur in play versus, like, their no hand, no board. And to that end, I really like the idea of Stubborn Denial, and Stubborn Denial is also a card that helps you in a wide variety of modern matchups. Things like Ad Nauseam, Burn, Tron, whatever, any combo deck, Infect, sure. Like, Stubborn Denial is really good against a lot of those decks, and it's kind of the card that the Jund deck really wanted because you have this mix of proactive and reactive stuff in the Grixis deck, which might seem like there's a little bit of dyssynergy going on. It's like, oh, sometimes I want to strip their hand, sometimes I want to counter their spells, and you end up with, like, these kind of inconsistent hands, or at the very least, like, you're not doing the same thing every game. But the thing is that these Thoughtseizes and these Inquisitions, a lot of the time, are taking things like Path to Exile and Fatal Push anyway. Stubborn Denial kind of solves that problem too. It is slightly worse with the Delve creatures in that you can't use discard spell and then delve away the discard spell. You have to, like, put the Tasker into play and then also have the mana open for Stubborn Denial, which might be a little difficult because you're not casting your spells to fuel Delve. But they are effectively accomplishing the same thing, and Stubborn Denial has a little bit of an added benefit over the discard spells. So between Stubborn Denial, Snapcaster Mage, and, you know, Tarfire just kind of sucking overall, I really wanted to try Grixis, and having Thought Scour to turn on Delirium was like one of the reasons why I wanted to try Sultai. And now that we don't have green, we don't have any Delirium stuff, but we do have Delve stuff, so there is that. So I kind of like that aspect of it. One thing that could potentially be changed is that I could have Mishra's Baubles over Serum Visions. So Serum Visions, it cycles and it allows you to set up the top of your deck. If you don't like those cards, then, you know, you get described at the bottom, hopefully draw something that does help you. A lot of the time, you're either looking for lands or removal or creatures, just threats. And Mishra's Bauble kind of helps that to some degree if you have fetch lands. So you're paying a mana to cycle, whereas Mishra's Bauble gives you the cycle but on the next turn, and it's not obviously not as powerful. It's like not actual scry, you know, like if you go fetch land Bauble and you Bauble yourself and it's a card that you want to keep, that means that you probably won't be able to play your Thoughtseize, you know, at least on time. So a lot of the time that happens where it's like, oh, I want to keep this Fatal Push, or I'd want to keep this Lightning Bolt, or whatever, your 1 mana instant speed removal spell, and then it doesn't really matter. You can draw it and then play it on your opponent's turn, but when it is specifically discard, it's kind of a feel bad. But Serum Visions would be taxing your 1 mana anyway, so I think it might actually be the same thing. And since Mishra's Bauble is much better with Tasker and Gourmet Gangler, it is possible that Mishra's Bauble is actually just better than Serum Visions, which seems kind of odd to say, but at least in the context of this deck, it might actually be true. And it's another thing that turns on Fatal Push, and granted you have 12 fetch lands, and, you know, running Snapcaster Mages into their X3s or whatever to turn on Revolt, but, you know, Mishra's Bauble does help with that too, so that is a consideration. I played with Serum Visions. I did like that it dug me pretty deep, and I think it helped a lot more in terms of like setting up your hand and stuff than Mishra's Bauble possibly could, but it also costs a mana, whereas Mishra's Bauble costs 0 mana, so I don't know. I do think it's close. And between the cantrips, you have the Thought Scours and the Serum Visions. Those kind of double as your traverses. Like, those are the things that help you find your threats. So there are games where you definitely feel a little threat light, but in those threat light games, like sometimes you have Snapcaster Mage with a bunch of removal spells, so you just kind of like play this longer game. You actually just get to play as Grixis Control for a little bit until you find a big threat, and then you just clock them very quickly with it. So it is not as consistent, at least consistent in that it doesn't do the Jund thing as often as the Jund deck does, but this version does have added benefits over the Jund version, which makes it a little different and therefore worth considering. So that's kind of why I threw this together. I like the 6 discard spells. I like the Stubborn Denials, at least as long as the metagame stays roughly the same as it is now. Obviously, there are metagames where Stubborn Denial is not very good. I like having Fatal Push over Lightning Bolt. Lightning Bolt itself is completely reasonable. It helps you turn on your Death Shadows a lot faster than Tarfire would, so there is that. But, you know, that's not really the primary use of Lightning Bolt in this deck, so it is mostly just there as additional 1 mana removal, and in that I think it does its job very well. And then we have the 2 Kolaghan's commands, which give you kind of a leg up in the Affinity matchup. They work really well with Snapcaster Mage and just kind of the discard spells in general, where you can really go after your opponent's hand. And the Kolaghan's commands kind of end up being a little bit more of a focal point in this deck because you have a higher land count, and that just means that you know, you get to, in the Jund deck, you would generally just like fire them off whenever you had a chance to, because they were not super valuable. But in this deck, they're actually pretty valuable because they can get back Snapcaster Mage, which then gets back a Kolaghan's command, and then it allows you to grind a lot harder. So you're a little bit more choosy with how you use your Kolaghan's commands in this version with Snapcaster Mage. So that's about it for the main deck. I have 5 shock lands. The second Steam Vents could potentially go, but as you'll see in these games, I kind of use all my lands. You know, I have 7 total lands, and they're all fairly useful. As for the sideboard, it kind of mirrors my Jund version. I have 1 Kozilek's Return. This is for Affinity and just random go-wide creature decks. Affinity is definitely the big one. I did want something to kill Etch Champion. We have 2 Liliana, the Last Hopes. With Snapcaster Mage, I didn't feel the need for Liliana in the main deck. You could certainly have 1 copy, I think, would be fine, especially because you do have Snapcaster Mage, which is very good with Snapcaster Mage. It was just, I have this, and this is kind of a 3-mana spell, and how many more 3-mana spells do I need? Not really. Not really many. So, these are relegated to the sideboard, but this is one of the best cards for grinding. 3 Collective Brutalities, additional discard spells, helps against burn. The real winner against burn is the 3rd Stubborn Denial, though. This is what stops you from getting burned out. A lot of the time, you can navigate the game to the point where you have like a Death Shadow in play and maybe like 7 life or so, and then they're just top decking, and sometimes they win those games, but Stubborn Denial just kind of puts the nail in the coffin. And also, you know, this is your negate, basically, and it does its job very, very well. Has some Fulminator Mages just for big mana decks. A couple Terminates because I wanted removal spells that killed bigger things like Reality Smasher, and if this deck is popular, you know, having something that kills Tasker and Gurmag Angler is going to be pretty important because Fatal Push does not do everything. It does close to everything, but not actual everything. And then the last card, Nile Spellbomb. So you definitely want some graveyard hate. 2 slots is completely reasonable. Having Surgical Extraction, especially since you have Snapcaster Mage, is also pretty reasonable, but I really like having Nile Spellbomb as this card that sits in play and actually messes with their traverses. And with Jund Death Shadow being basically the most popular deck in Modern now, and arguably the best deck, I think having your Graveyard Hate tailored specifically for that matchup is a completely reasonable choice. So that's what I'm doing, at least for right now. But yeah, deck is pretty sweet. I certainly like the Grixis playstyle. This one is definitely a little bit more aggressive than other Grixis decks that you have probably seen or played with in the past, but it is good. It is awesome. Let's get into the games.